The hall was enormous. It was so large that the ceiling disappeared into shadow and the lights that floated near. The top looked like distant stars. The walls were carved from a stone that no one could name, something older than the building itself, something that had been pulled from a world that no longer existed. The floor was smooth and cold, and reflected the figures that walked across it like a still pond reflects the sky. This was the grand hall of the Galactic Conclave. It had stood for over 3 million years. In that time, 212 civilizations had walked through its doors. Some had come as conquerors, some had come as refugees, some had come as equals. All of them in time had learned to bow their heads slightly when they entered, not out of any rule but because the weight of the place demanded it. Director Mari Thuron Solis did not bow her head. She walked in the way she always walked, straight-backed, hands loose at her sides, eyes forward. She was a tall woman, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that did not give anything away. She wore the plain gray uniform of the Human Directorate. No medals, no decorations, no rank insignia, beyond a single small pin on her collar, a circle with a line through it. It was the oldest symbol in the Directorate. Nobody outside the Directorate knew what it meant. She took her seat at the human delegation table. It was the smallest table in the hall. That was not an accident. Around her, the representatives of 212 civilizations were already seated. Some of them had bodies that filled entire sections of the room. The Gareth, a species of vast, slow-moving creatures that communicated through vibrations in the floor, occupied a raised platform on the far left. The Esalen, slender, silver-skinned, and very old, sat in a cluster near the center, their multiple eyes half closed, watching everything and showing nothing. The Vethka representatives sat directly across the hall from the human table. There were 12 of them, all in deep red armor, and their leader sat at the front. His name was Ambassador Vosterin. He was not a warm being. He had the look of something that had never once doubted itself, a look that came from centuries of winning and very little losing. He was looking at Mari Thuron Solis the way person looks at a piece of furniture, noting its presence, finding it unimportant. The session was called to order by the conclave moderator, a being called Elder Thuron Solis of the Esalen, who had held the position for 600 years and who spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through old trees. "We gather," Elder Thuron Solis said, "on a matter of territorial dispute. Vethka Empire has filed a formal claim of protective sovereignty over 3 human colony worlds, Hera's Landing, New Carthage, and the settlement cluster known as the Pale Reach. The human delegation has requested a formal session to respond to this claim. We hear them now." Mari Thuron Solis stood. She did not rush. She looked around the room slowly, making eye contact with each delegation in turn. Some looked back with curiosity, some with pity. The Vethka ambassador looked at the ceiling. "Thank you, Elder Thuron Solis," she said. Her voice was calm and clear. "We appreciate the opportunity to address the conclave. We understand the claim that has been filed. We understand the reasoning behind it. And we would like to ask a simple question before we respond." She paused. "Is there anyone in this room who actually believes the Vethka Empire is filing this claim to protect us?" The room went very quiet. "Ambassador Vosteran's eyes moved slowly back to her. They were pale eyes, almost colorless, and they did not change expression. "The human delegation," he said, his voice translated smoothly through the conclave's communication system, "is welcome to interpret our intentions. However it chooses, the fact remains that the three worlds in question sit within a region of space that is critical to Vethka security operations. We have offered to maintain human settlements on those worlds under full protective integration. The residents will lose nothing except the administrative burden of self-governance. They will lose their freedom," Marid Thuransoli said. "They will gain security," Vosteran replied. "Something humanity has precious little of, given its limited military capacity." There was a soft ripple through the room. It was the sound of 212 civilizations reacting to something that was technically impolite, but also technically true. Humanity's military capacity was, by galactic standards, small. Earth had joined the conclave 103 years ago, which made it the newest member. Its fleet consisted of roughly 400 vessels, most of them designed for exploration and cargo transport, with a smaller number of actual warships. Compact, well-built, but nothing that could compete with the Vethka's 4,000-strong war fleet. On the galactic scale, humanity was an infant. Everyone knew it. Most of the conclave felt something between fond condescension and mild pity when they thought about humanity at all. Marid Thuran Solis listened to the ripple in the room. She did not react to it. "We are aware," she said, "of how humanity is perceived within the conclave. We have never complained about that perception. We have been members for only a century. We understand that we are considered young." She folded her hands in front of her. "We are asking for 72 hours to consult with our administrative bodies on Earth. After that time we will return to this hall with our formal response to the Vethka claim." Elder Thuran Solis looked at her carefully. 72 hours is an unusual request for what the conclave had anticipated would be straightforward session. "We understand. We apologize for the inconvenience." Another ripple, this time softer. Confusion mostly. A few of the SLN representatives exchanged glances. The Gareth platform hummed faintly. Vosteran smiled. It was not a kind smile. "By all means," he said. "Take your 72 hours. We will wait." He said it the way someone says, "Of course," when they mean it doesn't matter. Marid Thuran Solis thanked the room and left the transport that carried her back to the human delegation. Ship was small and quiet. She sat alone in the passenger section, looking out at the conclave station. Through the porthole, it was a magnificent structure, a ring the size of a small moon orbiting a gas giant in neutral space, lit from within so that it glowed soft gold against the dark. She had always found it beautiful. She had also always found it slightly absurd, all this grandeur built by civilizations that had no idea what was actually out there. All these ancient species with their million-year histories and their carved stone halls and their quiet arrogance, sitting in the light and thinking themselves old. They had no idea. Her communication unit chimed. She accepted the call. The face on the screen was a man she had met only 3 times in her life. Despite having worked under his authority for 20 years, he was very old, though you would not know it from looking at him, which was itself a kind of answer to a question most people never thought to ask. His name was Administrator Kale, and he was the current head of the Directorate's Inner Council. How did it go? He asked. As expected, she said. They think we're going to fold, and are we? She looked at him for a moment. You know why I requested the 72 hours? I do, he said. I'm asking if you're certain. She turned back to the porthole. The conclave station was getting smaller as the transport moved away. The Vethka have 12 worlds under protective integration, she said. Populations on those worlds have no government, no military, and no legal standing to appeal their status under conclave law. They live in their homes and go to their jobs, and they are, for all practical purposes, property. She paused. Hera's Landing has 600,000 people on it. New Carthage has over 2 million. The Pale Reach has another 800,000. She looked back at the screen. I am certain. Administrator Kale was quiet for a moment. I will make the call, he said. Thank you. The screen went dark. On Earth, things happened that no one outside a very small group of people knew about. In the Atacama Desert, Chile, a section of ground that had appeared to be a geological research station for 40 years, quietly ceased its deception. The surface equipment was still. The people who monitored it from a distance, a small team of astronomers at a nearby university who had always wondered about the unusual energy readings from that site, noticed that their equipment suddenly stopped receiving any data at all. The readings did not spike or drop. They simply stopped, as if a door had been closed. In Siberia, in a region so remote that the nearest human settlement was 300 km away, a series of what appeared to be permafrost monitoring stations received a signal. The signal was 18 characters long. It had a specific structure that had not been used in 200 years, a structure that had been designed before digital communication was possible, back when the only way to send a message across great distances was to encode it in patterns of light. The stations received the signal and responded to it in the Pacific Ocean at a depth of 6,000 m, in a place where the pressure was enough to collapse any conventional submarine. Something woke up. It did not make noise. It did not move. It simply shifted from one state of being to another, from dormant to aware, like an eye opening in the dark, and in a location that existed on no official map, that was not registered with any government or agency or conclave record, that had been maintained in absolute secrecy since before the oldest currently serving conclave member had been born. A door opened. Marin Solis walked through it. The facility was not what people imagined when they thought of a secret base. It had no dramatic architecture, no rows of blinking lights, no armed guards in gleaming armor. It was a series of plain rooms connected by plain corridors lit by soft overhead panels, smelling faintly of something old. Not unpleasant, just old, like a library that had been there for a very long time. The people she passed in the corridors nodded to her. Some were young, some were very old. All of them had the same quality she had noticed since her first visit. They moved like people who had nowhere to rush to, not because they were lazy, but because they understood time differently than most people did. She was taken to a large circular room at the center of the facility. Around the room's perimeter there were seats. Most of them were occupied. The people sitting in them looked ordinary. That was the most unsettling thing about them. To anyone who knew who they looked like teachers, like doctors, like the kind of person you might see on a park bench feeding birds. They were dressed simply. They spoke quietly among themselves as she entered. Then they stopped and looked at her. "Director Solis," said the woman at the center. Her name was Petra. She was not the oldest person in the room. That honor belonged to a man named Hadri in the far corner, who was so old that the concept of age barely applied to him anymore, but she was the one who spoke. "For the council, sit down please." Marin sat. "You made your decision," Petra said. "It was not a question." "Yes, walk us through it." Marin did. She described the conclave session, the Vethka ambassador's tone, the thinly disguised contempt, the assumption that humanity would comply because humanity had no choice. She described the three worlds, the names, the populations, the people who would wake up one day to find that their government had been dissolved and their home had become a territory of an empire they had never voted for. She described the pattern, the 12 worlds already absorbed, the slow expansion, the way the Vethka had learned to use the conclave's own rules as cover for something that anyone with clear eyes could see was annexation. She said it all plainly, without drama. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the man named Hadri spoke. His voice was thin and dry, like a page turning. "We hoped," he said, "that we would not need to do this again." "I know," Marin said. "The fleet has been dormant for a very long time. I know. There will be no coming back from this," he said. "Once we reveal what we have, the galaxy will never see humanity the same way again. Every calculation every species has ever made about us, every assumption, every treaty, every alliance, will have to be reconsidered. Some of them will be afraid of us. Some of them will be angry that we kept this secret. The conclave may fracture. There will be consequences we cannot predict." "I know," Marin said for the third time. She looked at him steadily. "There are 600,000 people on Hera's landing, administrator, and 2 million on New Carthage, and 800,000 in the Pale Reach. They have families, they have children. They built those worlds with their hands." She stopped. "We built the fleet to protect people. That is why it exists. I'm not going to let 3 worlds fall into the Vethka's hands, because we are afraid of consequences." Hadri looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. Petra looked around the room. No one spoke against it. "Then we are agreed," she said. "We will wake them." 72 hours later, Marin Solis walked back into the grand hall of the Galactic Conclave. The room was exactly as she had left it, the same delegation, the same carved stone walls, the same floating lights near the ceiling. The Vethka ambassador sat in the same position with the same expression, patient in the way a large animal is patient before something small and slow finally crosses its path. Elder Thesivane called the session to order. "The human delegation has had its 72 hours, the elder said. "We welcome their response." Marin Solis stood up. She looked around the room. She looked at the Esalen who had watched civilizations rise and fall for millions of years and who still thought they had seen everything. She looked at the Garath, enormous and ancient, humming their slow thoughts into the floor. She looked at the Vethka, all 12 of them in their red armor, looking back at her with the flat, comfortable confidence of people who had never once Been surprised, she thought about Hera's. Landing, she thought about the children. There she thought about what the Vethka's protective integration would mean for them. She thought about the fleet, lying still in the dark beneath Jupiter's clouds beneath the ocean floor in the deep black between the planets waiting patient old beyond anything in this room. She took a breath. The human administration has considered the Vethka claim, she said. We have consulted with all relevant bodies. We have reached a decision. She paused. The answer is no. The 3 worlds named in the claim are human worlds. They will remain human worlds. We will not be surrendering sovereignty over them, not to the Vethka Empire, not to anyone else. The room did not erupt. It went very still instead, which was its own kind of eruption. Vasteran's pale eyes moved to her. Slowly, Director Solis, he said, and his voice was very quiet and very measured. I want to be certain you understand what you are saying. I do, she said. Humanity has 400 ships. The Vethka Empire has 4,000. You have been a spacefaring civilization for 2 centuries. We have been one for over 1,000,000 years. He leaned forward slightly. There is no version of this confrontation that ends well for Earth. Marin Solis looked at him for a long moment. We appreciate your concern, she said. We would like to invite you and any interested members of the conclave to observe our response in full. We will be transmitting coordinates shortly. She paused. We ask only that you be patient. What we are about to show you has not been seen in a very long time. We want to make sure everything is working correctly before we present it. The room stared at her. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and waited. No one in that room slept well. In the hours that followed, the Esalen analysts ran every known human military data point through their systems 3 times, trying to find something they had missed. They found nothing. Humanity's recorded fleet was exactly what it had always been: modest, functional, unremarkable. The Vethka military command ran probability models for every possible interpretation of Marin Solis's words. The highest probability outcome across every model was that humanity was bluffing. The second highest was that they had formed a secret alliance with another species and were about to reveal it. No model produced the actual answer. No model could, because no model had been built to account for the possibility that the youngest civilization in the galaxy had been lying about what it was for over 100 years, and that what it had actually been hiding was something so large, so old, and so deeply buried in the silence between the stars that the galaxy itself had forgotten it existed. Coordinates arrived 6 hours later. They pointed to the edge of the solar system. Yera had always been good at finding things that did not want to be found. It was the reason the intelligence division of the Esalen government had recruited her 20 years ago when she was still a junior academic at the University of Vessels, a place dedicated to studying the histories of other civilizations. She had a particular talent for reading gaps. Most analysts read what was there. Yera read what was missing. She understood that the shape of an absence told you just as much as the presence of information. Sometimes more. A question nobody asks is often more important than the questions everyone is asking. She had built a solid career on this. She had exposed a fuel trade conspiracy between 3 mid-tier conclave members. She had correctly predicted the Helvos compact's internal collapse 2 years before it happened. She had found evidence of a century-long false identity maintained by a Vethka spy operating inside a neutral trade station she was considered very good at her job. That was why, after Director Marin Solis walked out of the Grand Hall and the conclave began buzzing with confusion and speculation, her department head came to her desk and sat down and said simply, "I need a threat assessment on humanity, full profile. I need it before the Vethka make their next move." Yara had accepted the assignment without comment. She had poured herself a cup of the dark tea she kept on her desk and pulled up everything the Esalen intelligence archives had on Earth. She expected this to take about 2 days. She was wrong. The first thing she noticed was how thin the file was. Not thin in the sense that there was little data. The file on humanity was, in terms of raw volume, actually quite large. A century of conclave membership generated considerable records, trade agreements, diplomatic communications, population surveys, military registrations, scientific publications, public cultural archives. There was plenty of material on humanity as it presented itself. What was thin was everything before the conclave membership. According to official records, humanity had achieved basic spaceflight approximately 230 years ago. They had expanded slowly through their own solar system, then pushed out into nearby space. Their early expansion had been cautious, unremarkable. They had made first contact with the SciFiStories approximately 150 years ago, and the SciFiStories who handled most early contact situations for the conclave had assessed them as a young, promising, but clearly immature civilization with significant developmental potential. Standard classification. Hundreds of species had received the same assessment over the centuries. Membership application had followed in due course. Accepted. Standard probationary period. Full membership granted. File closed. It was all perfectly ordinary. Yara read it twice. Then she put it aside and started looking for what was not there. The first gap she found was geological. Human academic journals freely available through the conclave's shared library system contained a significant body of geological research about Earth itself. Yara was not a geologist, but she had, over the years, learned to read scientific papers well enough to spot when numbers did not fit the narrative around them. She was reading through a survey of deep ocean floor compositions when she found it. The paper was written by a human researcher named Dr. Avila, and it was about the unusual mineral deposits found along certain sections of the Pacific Ocean floor. The paper was dry and technical, but buried in one of its footnotes, the kind of footnote most readers skip, was a reference to structural anomalies inconsistent with natural geological formation previously surveyed in 2189 and reclassified as a preservation zone under Administrative Code 7741. Yara read the footnote 3 times. Administrative Code 7741. She searched for it. It took her 4 hours to find even a reference to it in human legal archives, because it had been filed under an obscure subsection of an environmental protection framework from 200 years ago. When she finally pulled the code itself, it said almost nothing useful. It classified certain deep ocean regions as protected sites due to historical and cultural significance, and restricted any survey, excavation, or research activity. In those regions, cultural significance. On the ocean floor in a region where no human civilization had ever lived as far as any record showed, she flagged it and kept going. The second gap was bigger. Energy readings. The conclave maintained a passive monitoring network across all member worlds, not surveillance in any meaningful sense, just a broad spectrum sensor web that tracked things like stellar activity, dark matter fluctuations, and the kind of large-scale energy outputs that could indicate weapons development or unusual construction. It was designed to catch civilizations that were secretly building things they had not disclosed. In 100 years of human membership, the network had never flagged anything unusual about Earth. The energy readings from the planet and its solar system were always within normal parameters. But when Yara pulled the raw, unprocessed data, not the summary reports, the actual numbers, she found something strange. There were 17 points in the human solar system where the data contained what she could only describe as static, not absence of signal, not zero readings, static, as if something was there producing a reading, but the reading was being scrambled before it could be coherently interpreted. She had seen static like that before, once, during the investigation of a Vethkok covert facility that had been using a specialized shielding technology to mask its energy output from conclave sensors. 17 points. She sat with that number for a while. Then she went back to the human academic archives and started looking for anything that might explain it. She found the word on the third day. It appeared first in a paper about ancient human mythology, a survey of preliterate oral traditions from Earth's earliest recorded cultural period. It was a word that appeared in several disconnected ancient cultures, in different languages with slightly different pronunciations, but always with the same meaning. The paper's author had flagged it as an interesting case of parallel cultural development, the same concept appearing independently across multiple ancient societies with no known contact between them. The word translated roughly as the old keepers or the ones who held the line. Depending on the cultural context, it sometimes carried a secondary meaning. The ones who are still there. Yara noted it. She filed it under interesting and moved on. She found it again in a different paper. This one was a historical linguistic study focused on ancient human military terminology. The author had traced the evolution of certain combat-related words across thousands of years of human language development, and in one section discussed a cluster of terms that appeared during what historians believed was a period of significant conflict in early human prehistory, well before the oldest known human written language, reconstructed through other means, words for large-scale organized defense, words for holding a position over a long time, words for war at a scale that seemed inconsistent with what early human civilization should have been capable of. The author had dismissed it as metaphorical language, primitive cultures often describing natural disasters or disease outbreaks in terms of organized warfare, standard academic reasoning. Yara had seen it many times when studying young civilizations, but she kept the paper open and went back to her notes. Static at 17 points. Preservation zones on the ocean floor. Administrative codes restricting access. to sites of mysterious cultural significance. Words for large-scale warfare appearing in human culture tens of thousands of years before humans should have had anything resembling a military. She opened a new search. She typed progenitor war. The results were thin, very thin. A handful of references scattered across human academic literature, almost all of them dismissive footnotes in mythology, surveys, brief mentions in fringe historical theories. One short paper from a researcher at a human university who had apparently written it late in his career and received very little academic attention for it. The paper argued that certain patterns in early human archaeological evidence, settlement destruction patterns, mass burial sites, unusual burn marks on certain types of ancient stone structures, suggested that humanity's preliterate period had included a conflict of a scale that mainstream historians had not accounted for. The paper was titled Evidence of Organized Defensive Conflict in the Preliterate Period. A reassessment. Yara read it in full. The researcher, a man named Professor Aldous Wren, who had apparently spent 40 years studying early human archaeology and had died 12 years ago, had been cautious. He was not claiming anything dramatic. He was simply pointing at a series of data points that did not fit the accepted timeline of human development and asking whether anyone had a better explanation. Nobody had given him one. The paper had been published in a low-circulation academic journal and largely ignored, but there was one passage that Yara read 3 times before she continued. Wren wrote, carefully and without drama, that the defensive structures he had found evidence of structures that no longer existed in any visible form, but whose foundations could be inferred from certain geological and archaeological markers were too large and too sophisticated for the level of civilization that was supposed to have existed at that time. He wrote that if his interpretation was correct, whatever had built those structures had not been doing so in response to other human groups. Scale and orientation of the defenses pointed outward, not at neighbors, at rivals on the same continent or the same planet. He wrote, the evidence suggests that whatever was being defended against did not come from Earth. Yara sat back in her chair. She looked at her notes. She looked at the empty cup of tea on her desk. She looked at the time and realized she had been working for 16 hours without a break. She thought about what she had gaps in geological records, massed energy readings at 17 points in human space, ancient words for large-scale warfare appearing thousands of years before humans should have had any reason to develop them, and a dead archaeologist quietly suggesting that prehistoric humanity had built large defensive structures aimed at something that came from outside the planet. She thought about the way Marin Solis had walked out of the grand hall, the way she had looked around the room before she spoke, the way she had said, "What we are about to show you has not been seen in a very long time." Not as a threat, not as a boast, but in the same tone a person uses when they are telling you something that is simply plainly true. Yara filed an urgent priority report to her department head. The report said, in summary, the standard threat assessment on humanity could not be completed. Standard methodology was insufficient. The gaps in the available data were not the result of poor record keeping or limited access. They were deliberate. Someone had spent a very long time making sure those gaps existed. The assessment requested was therefore not, how dangerous is humanity? A question whose answer was almost certainly not what anyone in the conclave currently believed, but rather, what is humanity hiding? How long have they been hiding it, and why? She sent the report. Then, without waiting for a response, she went back to work. 3 things happened in the next 24 hours that she did not know about. The first was that her department head read her report, looked at the supporting data she had attached, and went very still for a long time at his desk. Then he forwarded it to his superior with a note that said, simply, read this immediately. The second was that the Vethka Military Command, having received the coordinates from the human delegation, dispatched a scout vessel to the edge of the human solar system. The scout vessel arrived, took up an observation position, and reported back that there was nothing there, empty space, normal readings, nothing to see. 22 hours later, the same scout vessel reported again. This time the message was different. This time the tone of the transmission, even filtered through translation software, carried something that the Vethka communications team had never heard from one of their military vessels before. Carried fear. The third thing that happened was in a facility that no intelligence agency in the galaxy knew about, deep inside the Earth, where a group of very old, very calm people sat around a circular room and listened to reports from the 17 points across the solar system. The report said the same thing from all 17 points. The systems were online. The engines had tested clean. The power cores, which had been dormant for longer than most civilizations had existed, were running at full capacity. The shielding was holding. The weapon systems had completed their self-diagnostics. Everything was ready. Petra, who spoke for the council, listened to all 17 reports before she spoke. When she finally did, her voice was quiet and even the voice of someone who had thought about this moment for a very long time. Tell them to hold position, she said. Director Solis will give the signal. Yara was still at her desk when the first images came through from the Vethka scout vessel. She almost knocked her chair over standing up. Images were from the scout vessel's long-range sensors taken at the edge of human space, looking inward toward the solar system, and in those images at 17 points spread across the vast dark interior of the system, there were shapes that the scanner's resolution could not fully capture. But even at that resolution, even at that distance, they were impossible to mistake. They were ships. They were enormous. They were dark. Dark in a way that went beyond color, as though they absorbed everything that touched them and gave back nothing. And they were everywhere, rising from beneath the clouds of the gas giant, rising from the dark between the inner planets, rising from the deep ocean floor of the little blue world at the center of the system. Yara counted what she could see. In the images, she counted for a long time, then she stopped counting and simply stared, because the number she was arriving at was not 400. It was not close to 400. It was a number that did not fit any model the SA Elan Intelligence Division had ever built. It was a number that did not fit the history of the galaxy as anyone understood it. It was a number that made everything she had read in the last 3 days suddenly, terribly, completely Clear, humanity had not joined the conclave as a young, naive species finding its footing among the stars. Humanity had been watching, waiting, playing a role they had chosen for themselves, and beneath that role, buried in silence beneath the ocean floors and the gas clouds and the quiet, dark between the planets, they had been keeping something that the rest of the galaxy had not even known was possible to keep. They had been keeping an entire war. She reached for her communication unit and called her department head. He answered immediately. His face told her he had already seen the images. Tell me I'm reading this wrong, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Go home, Yara, he said quietly. Sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a very different kind of day. He ended the call. She sat at her desk for another hour, looking at the images before she finally shut down her screen. When she walked out of the building and into the night air of the Elan capital, she looked up at the sky automatically, the way she always had since she was a child, looking at the stars and feeling the comfortable smallness of being one person under an enormous and ancient sky. The feeling was the same. The sky looked the same, but something in it had changed. The stars looked the same, but somewhere among them, or between them, or in the dark places that light never reached, something that humanity had fought once before was, according to old sensors older than her civilization, beginning to move again. She did not know that part yet. She would. Supreme Commander Davith Rail had commanded the Vethka war fleet for 31 years, and in that time he had seen things that most beings never see. He had seen a star being eaten by its own gravity, a slow, silent collapse that took 6 hours and turned a system of 12 worlds into dust and memory. He had led the fleet through the Garath corridor, a region of space so dense with debris and radiation that 3 of his ships had been lost before they reached the other side, and he had brought the remaining ships through by flying in total sensor blackout, trusting mathematics instead of instruments. He had stood on the bridge of his flagship during the siege of the Velm Compact, a campaign that lasted years and had never once shown fear to the people who served under him. He was not a man who was easily disturbed. He was disturbed now. He stood at the forward observation deck of his flagship, the Absolute Meridian, which was the largest warship in the Vethka Empire's fleet, 2.8 km from bow to stern, armed with weapon systems that could reduce continent to glass in under an hour, crewed by 4,000 of the finest military personnel his civilization had ever produced. It was the pride of the Vethka Empire. When people in the conclave thought about military power, they thought about ships like the Absolute Meridian. He had always found that deeply satisfying. He was not finding it satisfying right now. He was looking at the data on the screens around him. He was looking at the scout vessels report. He was looking at the images, the ones taken at the edge of human space, showing shapes rising out of the dark interior of the solar system. He had been looking at them for 40 minutes, which was 39 minutes longer than he had expected to spend on anything having to do with humanity. Tell me again, he said to no one in particular. His sensor chief, a young officer named Vethprin, answered carefully. The scout vessel's long-range sensors detected the first readings approximately 6 hours ago. The readings were small at first. They grew. The Current imagery shows she stopped. Go. Ahead, the imagery shows multiple objects of significant size distributed across 17 points within the human solar system. The objects are. She stopped again. Veth Prin. They don't read as ship's commander, not on any of our standard sensor bands. They have mass, they have energy output, they are clearly solid objects, but our sensor systems are not recognizing their composition. The material their hulls are made of doesn't match anything in our database. She paused. And they're moving slowly. But they're moving. Daveth Rail looked at the images again. How many? He asked. Veth Prin hesitated. This he knew was not because she was uncertain of the number. It was because she did not want to say it. 847 confirmed, she said. Sensors are still completing sweeps of the outer system. There may be more. The bridge of the absolute meridian was very quiet. Daveth Rail had brought his fleet to the human solar system in arrangement that he privately thought of as the kind of formation a predator takes before it closes in, spread wide, covering all approaches, overwhelming in number. 4,000 ships, the finest weapons in the known galaxy. He had not been expecting a fight. He had been expecting a surrender, a clean one, the kind that came when the other side looked at what was facing them and made the intelligent decision. He was still expecting a surrender, but it was taking longer to arrive than planned. And the reason it was taking longer was that the sensor data on his screens was not cooperating with his expectations. Run the numbers again, he said. Commander, we've run them 4 times. Run them again. 300,000 km away at the edge of the human solar system. The Vethka fleet held its position and ran its numbers. Ships communicated with each other in rapid bursts of coded transmission. Analysts compared data. Zets. Senior officers convened emergency briefings. The military command structure of the most powerful empire in the galactic conclave, 4,000 ships strong, stared at its sensor screens and tried to make sense of what it was seeing. And in the center of the solar system, rising without noise or hurry from the places they had slept for 800,000 years, the old ships continued to move. First one to fully clear its hiding place was the one beneath Jupiter. Jupiter was the largest planet in the human solar system, a vast, violent ball of gas and storm. Its surface a permanent hurricane of color and force, its interior layers of pressure so intense that conventional matter behaved in ways that normal physics did not easily predict. It was not a place where anyone had expected to find anything of military significance. The conclave survey teams, during their standard assessment of humanity's solar system 100 years ago, had logged it as scientifically interesting and strategically irrelevant. They had not looked deep enough. It rose slowly, first as a shape in the sensor readings, a mass where no mass should have been, moving upward through the gas layers at a pace that seemed almost thoughtful. Then as a shadow in the upper cloud bands, a darkness moving beneath the surface of the storms, then finally through the clouds themselves, shedding them like a thing shedding water, rising into the black above Jupiter's atmosphere, into clear space, and becoming visible. It was not the largest of the old ships, but it was the first one that every sensor array on every Vethka vessel was pointed at, so it was the one everyone saw first. It was 2.5 km long. Its hull was the color of space itself. Not black, but the specific absence of color that exists between stars. A surface that did not reflect light, but seemed to pull it inward. It had no visible thruster ports, no engine exhaust, no running lights, no markings of any kind that any Vethka analyst could identify. Its shape was not the shape of a ship designed by beings who were afraid. It was clean and hard and deliberate, built by minds that understood war at a level that went beyond strategy into something older. It moved without making a single detectable energy signature, not because its engines were off, because whatever moved it was not something the Vethka sensors had ever been designed to detect. It took up a position above Jupiter's northern pole and stopped. The Vethka fleet looked at it in silence. Then the second one cleared the asteroid belt. Then the third came up from the far side of the moon. Then all at once, across 17 points in the solar system, they all began to move on the bridge of the absolute meridian. Nobody spoke. David watched his screens. He watched shape after shape emerge from concealment, from gas clouds, from ocean depths, from the cold dark between the planets where no survey had ever thought to look. He watched his sensor chief's hands move across her console, trying to compile a complete count, failing because the sensors were not built for this, not designed for a situation where this many objects of this size were appearing simultaneously in a space that had registered as ordinary for 100 years. He was not a man who prayed. The Vethka, as a species, had moved past religion several thousand years ago, but standing on the bridge of his flagship, watching 847 ancient warships arrange themselves in the darkness of the human solar system, he felt something that he had no other word for. He felt small. He had not felt small in a very long time, perhaps never. He was the supreme commander of the most powerful military fleet in the conclave. He had spent his entire career as the largest, most dangerous thing in any room he entered. It was not arrogance. It was simply the truth of his situation. A truth so consistent and so long-standing that he had stopped noticing it. He noticed now. He noticed it very clearly. He opened a channel to the human delegation ship. Marin Solis was already on the line. She had been watching the same feeds from a different angle. The telemetry from her fleet, relayed through channels the Vethka could not intercept. She watched the numbers come in. She watched the old ships take their positions. She watched a century of careful, deliberate performance, humanity as the small, young, fragile newcomers come to a quiet end. She felt something complex when she saw it. Not pride exactly. Pride was too simple a word for it. It was more like the feeling of a door opening that had been closed for a very long time, a rush of air from a room you had sealed for reasons you still believed in, releasing into the light. She answered the channel. Supreme Commander, she said. David Rails' voice was controlled. She gave him credit for that. Most beings looking at what he was looking at would have had more trouble keeping their voice steady. Director Solis, he said. I think we need to talk. I agree, she said, but first. She paused and chose her next words carefully. I want you to understand that what you are seeing is not a threat. These ships have not powered their weapons. They are simply showing themselves. We wanted you to know what exists before we continued The conversation about the three worlds, what is this, he asked it, was not really a military question. It was more personal than that. This is what we are, she said, a long silence. How long, he asked, how long have these ships been there, she thought. About how to answer that. She thought about the council in the circular room, about Hadri with his dry, old voice and his 800,000 years of carefully maintained secrets. She thought about the right way to say something that had no easy way to be said. A very long time, Commander, she said, long enough that the answer will take some explaining. I suggest we schedule a full briefing, open channel. The entire conclave invited to observe. There are things about humanity that everyone needs to know. We have kept them quiet for reasons that made sense at the time and still make sense now. But those reasons are changing. Another silence, longer this time. Is this, he started, then stopped. He tried again. The conclave needs to know. Everyone needs to know what they're looking at. Yes, she said. They do. The emergency session of the Galactic Conclave was called within hours. Every delegation attended. The hall was fuller than it had been in decades. Representatives who were usually content to participate remotely had physically traveled to the station because what was happening was not the kind of thing that felt right to watch on a screen. Marin Soli stood at the center of the hall. She looked different somehow. She had not changed her clothes. She had not changed her posture. But something about the air around her was different, the way air is different before a storm, when the pressure has shifted and the world is holding its breath. She began to speak. She spoke for 2 hours. She did not use notes. She did not use visual aids at first. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are telling the truth about something they have kept to themselves for a very long time. Carefully, clearly, in the right order, leaving nothing essential out. She told them that the ships they were now watching on their feeds, the feeds from the Vethka scout vessel that the entire conclave was now watching in real time, were real. She told them that there were 847 of them currently visible, and that the final count was not yet complete. She told them that the ships had been in their current positions, hidden for longer than the galactic conclave itself had existed. She told them that the ships had not been built by the humanity the conclave knew, the young, modest, careful species that had joined 100 years ago. They had been built by a humanity that none of them knew at all. Then she asked permission to show them something. The hall agreed. The projection system in the center of the floor came to life. What it showed was not a map or a chart. It was a ship, one of the old ones, shown in detail, rotating slowly so that every angle was visible. It was accompanied by data points that her team had compiled specifically for this presentation. The design age estimate, approximately 800,000 years. The hull material, unknown to any current database. Propulsion method, unknown to any current science. The weapons systems, partially accessible. Those that could be measured produced readings that made several senior military officers in the room go very still. The hall was quiet for a long time after the projection appeared. Elder Thesavine of the Salen, who had run the conclave for 600 years and had seen things that most beings could not imagine, spoke first. Director Solis, the elder said, and the old voice was, for the first time in Yaru's memory, not Quite steady. How old did you say these ships are? Our best current estimate, Marin said, is 800,000 years, give or take. Hall absorbed this. The Salin have been spacefaring for 4 million years. Elder Thesavine said slowly, yes. Marin said, we know, humanity, according to your own stated history, has been spacefaring for 200 years. According to our stated history. Marin agreed, yes. Another silence. The elder looked at her, the Hall looked at her. 212 civilizations, the oldest and most powerful the galaxy had produced, looked at the woman from the youngest species in the conclave and waited. I think, said Marin Solis, that it is time to talk about our actual history outside the station in the dark of neutral space. A Vethka scout vessel held its position at the edge of the human solar system and continued transmitting its feed to the rest of the fleet. The feed showed the old ship spread across the solar system in a formation that no military analyst had yet been able to fully map because the sheer scale of it exceeded their software's display capacity. It showed them sitting still and dark in the space between the planets, patient, the way only something very old can be. Patient, not the patience of waiting, but the patience of something that has already done what needed to be done and is simply resting until the next time it is needed. The scout vessel's pilot, a young officer on her second deployment, had been watching the feed for hours. She had stopped trying to count the ships. She had stopped trying to match them to anything in her training or her experience or her knowledge of what the galaxy contained. She had grown up hearing stories of the Vethka Empire's power. She had trained for years to serve in its fleet. She had been proud to be part of the greatest military force her civilization had ever built. She was still proud. She would always be proud of that. But looking at those ships, dark and vast and ancient, rising from places where nothing should have been, built by hands that had worked 800,000 years ago toward a purpose that she was only beginning to understand, she felt something shift inside her, something that was not quite fear and not quite awe but contained both. She thought about what her commander had said on the general channel, repeating what the human director had told him. This is what we are. She looked at the ships for a long time, then quietly to the empty cockpit around her. She said, "Who are you?" The ships did not answer. They did not need to. The briefing lasted 3 days, not because the information was complicated. It was, in fact, delivered in the simplest possible language. Marin Solis and the team of historians and scientists she had brought with her from Earth were careful about that. They had prepared for this moment. They had spent years preparing for it, knowing that when it came, the people sitting in front of them would be in a state of shock, and shocked minds need clear words, not complex ones. The briefing lasted 3 days because every time a new piece of information was presented, the hall needed time to absorb it before it could continue, not time to debate it, not time to challenge it, just time to sit with it and breathe. On the first day, the conclave learned that humanity had existed as a spacefaring civilization for over 900,000 years. On the second day, they learned what that civilization had fought. On the third day, they learned why humanity had chosen to forget. On the morning of the first day, Marin Solis pulled up a star chart. The chart showed the galaxy as it was now, A familiar image, the long spiral arms, and the dense bright center, the scatter of known civilizations marked as points of light everyone in the hall had seen. Versions of this chart thousands of times. It was ordinary, it was comfortable. We are going to look at this chart differently, she said. We are going to remove everything younger than 1 million years. She touched the control. Most of the points of light vanished. The Salen remained. They were 4 million years old. A handful of other ancient species, most of them so far from the galactic center that even the conclave rarely dealt with them, also remained. But the vast majority of the familiar civilizations, the Vethka, the Garath, the dozens of species that made up the conclave's active political body, disappeared from the map. Now, Marin said, we add humanity. A single point of light appeared near the galaxy's third arm. The hall looked at the star chart, a galaxy populated by almost nothing, and one bright point of light where humanity was 900,000 years ago. Marin said, humanity reached the stars for the first time. We were not the same as we are now. We were older in some ways and younger in others. We had technology that our current civilization is only beginning to rediscover. We had been building that technology for a long time because we had been watching something approach from outside the galaxy, and we knew we were going to need it. She paused to let that settle. The entities we were watching did not come from any star system. They came from the space between galaxies, the great empty dark that separates one galaxy from another. They had been crossing that dark for longer than our civilization had existed. We do not know where they originated. We do not know what they were in a biological sense. We know what they did. She switched the chart again. The new image showed the same galaxy, but with a different kind of marking, spreading from one edge like something being slowly poured across the map. Region after region of space marked in a deep flat gray. They consumed, she said. That is the only word we ever found for it. They did not colonize. They did not communicate. They did not take resources in any way we could understand. They moved through a region of space, and afterward nothing remained. Not the planets, not the stars, not the dust between them. Whatever they were, they processed everything they touched into something unrecognizable. And then they moved on. The gray spread across the map, covered approximately a third of the galactic edge. 37 civilizations died in that region before humanity made contact with any of them. Marin said, we know this because we found the evidence afterward, the places where stars should have been and weren't, the echoes in the cosmic background that told us what had happened. Those civilizations might have been, probably were, on paths that would have led them to space, to the conclave, to everything you see in this hall now. We will never know because they were erased before they had the chance. The hall was absolutely silent. Even the Garath, whose communications ran through vibrations in the floor, had gone still. The normal low hum of their platform had stopped. Humanity built the fleet, Marin said, because we understood that what was coming could not be stopped with small ships. It could not be stopped with the weapons that existed at the time. It required something that had never been built before. Ships designed not just to fight, but to fight something that operated on a scale most military thinking had never needed to address. It took us approximately 120,000 years to build the fleet to a size and capability that we believed was sufficient. She looked around the room. We were cutting it close, she said. They arrived before we thought they would. The second day was harder. The second day was about the war itself. Historians who presented this material were gentle with it. They had to be. Some of it was difficult to hear, even for beings who had been prepared for it. For beings who were hearing it for the first time, it was the kind of information that changed how a person looked at the sky. The war had lasted 40,000 years. Not 40,000 years of continuous battle. It was not fought that way. It was fought in long campaigns separated by periods of quiet during which both sides reorganized. The entities, humanity's historians referred to them in the old records simply as the void, because they had come from the void and because they were functionally an absence of everything they touched, did not operate in ways that mapped neatly to conventional military thinking. They did not have flanks. They did not hold territory. They moved in patterns that humanity had spent centuries learning to read and eventually slowly to predict. The fleet suffered losses that were by any measure catastrophic. Of the original 847 ships, the number that currently sat in the human solar system, 412, had been destroyed during the war. They had been rebuilt over centuries, repaired, upgraded, replaced. The 847 ships currently in the system were not all original. Some were. Some were rebuilt versions of originals. Some were later additions built during the war itself. When it became clear that more were needed, the cost in lives was not presented as a number. It was presented as a silence. The historian who covered this section of the briefing stopped speaking for one full minute, and no one in the hall moved or spoke during that minute, and somehow everyone in the room understood that the silence was the most honest answer available. The war ended not with a decisive battle, but with a slow retreat. The entities damaged in ways that humanity's weapons had finally managed to achieve after decades of figuring out how, pulled back from the galaxy's edge, they went back to the intergalactic dark. They did not return. Humanity declared nothing. There was no victory speech. There was no celebration, at least none that had been recorded. What the records showed in the immediate aftermath was simply the fleet returning to the solar system, and then over the following centuries, something that the historians call the Great Decision. Marin herself presented the Great Decision on the third day. She stood at the center of the hall and explained it the way she had explained it to herself many times in private over the years. She had served the directorate, trying to understand it fully, trying to hold all of it at once. When the war ended, she said, humanity faced a problem that had no good solution. We had built something that was powerful enough to fight what we had fought. That power did not go away when the war did, and a galaxy that had not known about the war, had not built toward it, had not prepared for it. A galaxy full of young civilizations, developing in peace, a galaxy with that power loose in it, available, known about, possibly coveted or competed for, was a more dangerous place than the galaxy had been before. She paused. There was also the question of what the knowledge would do, she said, if we told every civilization that had just begun to reach the stars that something had come from the dark between galaxies, and eaten a third of the galactic edge. And that it might come back, what would that do to them, to how they developed, to how they thought about the universe, to the choices they made in building their own civilizations? She looked at the faces around her. We did not know, she said, and we were tired. We had fought for 40,000 years. We had lost more than we could count. We were not in a state to make confident decisions about the future of other civilizations. So we made the only decision we believed we could defend. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at the room. We buried the fleet. We buried the history. We dismantled our civilization down to something that could live quietly on one world, and we started again. We kept a small group, the directorate, to maintain what we had buried, to watch for what might return, and to make the decision about what to do if it did. Another pause. We chose to appear young, she said, not because we were ashamed of what we had done. We were never ashamed of that. We chose it because appearing young meant that no other civilization would ever be tempted by what we had, or frightened of it, or try to take it. It meant the galaxy could develop in peace the way it deserved to. The hall was very quiet. We are telling you now, she said, because the situation has changed. Yara found out about the sensors through a colleague who called her in the middle of the night, his voice tight with something she had never heard from him before. The deep range array, he said, the one we've had monitoring the galactic rim since we built it 300 years ago. It just tripped every single alert. It has. She sat up. What did it detect? Movement, he said, from the intergalactic medium past the galactic edge, something coming inward. She was silent for a moment. How big? She said. We don't know yet. We don't have enough data points. But Yara, he stopped. She could hear him breathing. The signature matches something in the deep archive, something we flagged as a historical anomaly and never fully investigated because it was so old. The data seemed corrupted, but it's not corrupted. It's a match. She knew what he was going to say before he said it. It matches the energy signature recorded at the galactic edge 800,000 years ago, he said, before the records go blank. She sat in the dark of her quarters and looked at the wall. Send me everything, she said. Back in the circular room, deep beneath the Earth's surface, the Council received the same information through their own channels that had been active for 800,000 years, maintained and upgraded over the centuries, never turned off, never allowed to lapse. Hadri read the report. He set it down on the table in front of him and looked at it for a long time. How long? He asked the analyst standing before him, a young woman named Cass who had joined the directorate 12 years ago and who handled the long-range monitoring systems. Replied carefully. Based on current trajectory and the speed of the last approach, we estimate between 300 and 500 years. The uncertainty band is large because we're working from incomplete readings, but it is coming. Yes, she said, it's coming. Hadri nodded slowly. He thought about 800,000 years. He thought about the weight of it, carrying a secret that large for that long, across so many generations of human beings, maintaining the fiction of youth and smallness and ordinariness. While the fleet slept in the dark, he thought about the 37 civilizations that had not survived the first approach. He thought about the Ession sitting in the conclave with their 4 million years of history, believing they were the oldest and wisest thing in the room, not knowing that humanity had been carrying the galaxy's survival on its back since before the Essian had first looked up at the sky. He thought about what it would mean now to ask for help. Tell Director Solis, he said, she needs to complete the briefing. In the grand hall of the conclave, Marin Solis stood before 212 civilizations and told them the last part. She told them about the sensors. She told them about the movement at the galactic rim. She told them about the 300 to 500 year estimate, wide, uncertain, but not uncertain enough to ignore. She told them that 847 ships, as old and as powerful as they were, might not be enough this time. The entities had been damaged in the last war. They had retreated, but 800,000 years was a long time. Whatever they were, whatever drove them, whatever gave them the ability to consume everything they touched, 800,000 years was long enough to recover, long enough to adapt, long enough to have learned something from a defeat that they had, in all probability, never experienced before. We are not asking for your submission, she said. We are not asking for your territory or your resources or your loyalty. We are asking for your help. She looked around the room. What we built once, we may need to build again. Bigger, better, designed for what we now know instead of what we were guessing at, and we cannot build it alone, not in the time we have, and not with the knowledge that any single civilization carries. She stopped. Humanity has been standing between this galaxy and the dark for 800,000 years. She said, we stood alone last time because there was no one else. There is someone else now. There are 212 civilizations in this room, some of them millions of years old, all of them brilliant, all of them capable of things we are not, if what is coming is what our sensors suggest it is. She let the sentence rest. We would very much like to not stand alone this time. The hall was silent for a long moment. Then Elder the Savine of the Essian, 600 years old, the oldest serving conclave official, a being who had presided over wars and treaties and the birth and death of species, did something that no one in the hall had ever seen the elder do. The elder stood up, not to speak, just to stand, and slowly, one by one, the representatives of 212 civilizations stood with them. The Vethka Empire did not go to war with humanity. This was not a decision that came easily. It was not a decision that came quickly. For the 3 days of the conclave briefing, while Marin Solis stood in the hall and rebuilt the understood history of the galaxy from the ground up, Supreme Commander Davith Rail sat in his command room aboard the Absolute Meridian and thought. He was a man who had made many decisions in his life, and he had always made them the same way, by calculating, by running the numbers, by looking at the situation from every angle available and identifying the path that produced the best outcome for the Vethka Empire. He had never made a decision based on emotion. He considered that kind of decision-making to be a weakness that he had spent his career disciplining out of himself. He spent 3 days trying to calculate his way out of this situation. The numbers were simple. His fleet, 4,000 ships, the finest in the galaxy. The human fleet, 847 ships, origin unknown, age unknown, capability partially assessed and uniformly alarming. his fleet could not win a direct engagement. This was not an opinion. His weapons officers had run 12 different models for a direct engagement, using the most optimistic assumptions available for Vethka weapons performance and the most pessimistic assumptions available for the human ship's durability. In all 12 models, the Vethka fleet was destroyed. In the worst models, it happened in under 4 hours. So the calculation was simple. His fleet could not take the 3 worlds by force. Not with those ships sitting in the solar system, watching everything with their dark, quiet patience. But then he thought about the briefing. He thought about what he had been told, what the whole galaxy had been told, about where those ships had come from, and what they had been built for. He thought about 37 civilizations ground into nothing by something that had come from the dark between galaxies. He thought about a war that had lasted 40,000 years. He thought about what humanity had done during that war and why, and what they had chosen afterward and why, and he found slowly that his calculation had shifted. It had shifted because the question had changed. It was no longer, can we take those 3 worlds? The answer to that was clearly no, and no was a simple, clean answer that cost nothing but pride to accept. The new question, the one that the briefing had introduced, the one he could not stop thinking about, was something much larger. He had spent 31 years as the most powerful military presence in the conclave. He had built his career on the understanding that the Vethka Empire was, when it came to questions of survival and strength, the best answer the galaxy had. He had believed that sincerely. He had believed that the galaxy's best chance at long-term stability was under Vethka influence. He still believed it. But the frame around that belief had changed, because standing between his fleet and the peaceful galaxy behind it, there were 847 ships that had been designed to fight something his entire civilization had never known was possible. And behind those ships, invisible but present in every piece of sensor data his analysts had reviewed, was a question his military training had never prepared him for. What good was the Vethka Empire? What good was any empire, any fleet, any political structure the galaxy had ever built, if the thing coming from the rim reached it? He thought about that for a long time. Then he opened a channel to Director Marin Solis. I am withdrawing the protective sovereignty claim, he said. He said it the way he had said most things in his life, directly, without softening it, without explaining more than was necessary. It was a clean statement of a clean decision. Marin Solis looked at him from the screen. Her expression did not change. He was beginning to understand an extraordinary capacity for looking at things without reacting to them, not because she was cold, but because she was precise. She saved her reactions for the moments that deserved them. Thank you, Commander, she said. I have conditions, he said, not for withdrawing the claim. That stands regardless, but for what comes next. He paused. The Vethka Empire wants to be part of what you are proposing, full participation, not as a subordinate member, as a partner. That is what I am proposing to everyone, she said. There are no subordinate members in what I have in mind. He looked at her. Do you trust us to mean it? It was an odd question. He knew that it was the kind of question that a diplomat would never ask directly, and he was not a diplomat. But he was, in this moment, trying to be honest in a way that his position rarely required of him, and honesty sometimes came out in odd ways. Marin Solis. Consider the question. I trust you to understand what's coming, she said. I trust that you're intelligent enough to know that what's in your interest and what's in everyone's interest are the same thing right now. I trust that the Vethka Empire did not become the most powerful force in the conclave by making the wrong calculation when it mattered. She paused. I do not think you will need to be trusted to mean it. I think you will mean it. David Rail looked at her for a moment. He nodded once. Then, we have a great deal of work to do, he said. Yara received her access to the Progenitor War Archive on a Tuesday morning. She had been working without authorization for 2 weeks, pulling threads and following them into corners that made her superiors uncomfortable. She had filed 7 reports. She had received 3 official requests to narrow the scope of her investigation and 2 unofficial suggestions that she might benefit from a short leave of absence. She had ignored all of them when the message came from the Human Directorate offering her full unrestricted access to the complete historical archive of the Progenitor War. She read it 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. Then she accepted before anyone could change their minds. The archive was stored on a data system that the Directorate had maintained for 800,000 years, upgraded through countless generations of technology, always keeping the oldest records intact. It was not organized the way modern archives were organized. It was layered, the most recent records on top, each layer beneath representing an older era, going down and down through centuries and millennia until you reached the deepest levels, which were in a format so old that even the Directorate's translation tools struggled with them. She read for 6 days. She read about the early warning systems humanity had built before the entities arrived, sensor networks spread across the galactic edge, watching and reporting for thousands of years before the first contact. She read about the initial encounters, which were not battles in any conventional sense, more like testing, both sides learning what the other was capable of. She read the tactical logs of the early fleet engagements written by commanders who had no manual for what they were doing, who were inventing the rules as they went, paying for each new understanding with ships and lives. She read about the point in the war, roughly 20,000 years in, when humanity had developed a weapon capable of actually damaging the entities. The record of that moment was brief, almost understated, a single line in what appeared to be an operational log. First confirmed cessation of advancement in Sector 7, weapon effective. Replicate immediately. She read about the slow turning of the war's tide. Not a sudden reversal. Nothing about the war had been sudden, but a gradual grinding change in momentum, the way a very large thing changes direction with enormous effort over enormous time, and with no guarantee at any point that it would continue to change. She read the last entries of the war, the final engagements, the retreat of the entities, the quiet in their wake. She read the long, careful deliberations of what the archive called the Council of Witnesses, the original Directorate, gathered in the ruins of a civilization that had won something unimaginable and was trying to decide what to do with the winning. And she read the decision they had made on the morning of the 7th day she closed the archive. She sat in the small room she had been given access to in the human delegation facility, a plain room, nothing special about it, a desk and a chair and a window that showed a patch of the station's outer ring, and she sat very still for a long time. Her assistant, a young Ezelan named Vel, who had been bringing her food and tea every 6 hours and quietly making sure she was still functional, knocked and entered. "How are you?" Vel asked carefully. Yara looked at him. She thought about how to answer that. "Do you know," she said, "that for 4 million years the Ezelan have thought of themselves as the elders of the galaxy, the oldest spacefaring civilization, the ones with the longest memory?" Vel nodded. Every Ezelan child learned this. It was as fundamental as breathing. "We were wrong," Yara said simply. She said it without bitterness or drama, just as a fact. "We were never the elders. We were the children, and humanity was the parent, and they were too kind and too careful to tell us." She looked at the window. "For 4 million years, while we built our civilization and our history and our pride, there was another civilization watching from the shadows, not watching to control us, not watching to judge us, watching to protect us from something we didn't." Vel was quiet. "They never asked for anything," she said. "They never wanted recognition or gratitude or influence. They just stood there in the dark between us and the thing in the dark. For 800,000 years." She was quiet for a moment. "I need to speak to Director Solis," she said. "The Alliance did not come together all at once. Nothing real ever does. It came together the way large, difficult thing comes together, slowly, with arguments and hesitations, and moments of doubt, with species that had been rivals for centuries having to sit in the same rooms and agree on things they had never agreed on before. There were sessions that lasted for days. There were sessions that ended badly and had to be resumed the next morning. There were civilizations that almost walked out and didn't, and civilizations that did walk out and eventually came back, and civilizations that took months to decide before they finally committed. But it came together. Human engineers, members of the Directorate who had spent centuries maintaining knowledge that the rest of humanity had chosen not to keep, stepped out of the shadows they had lived in and began teaching. They were careful about it. They taught what was needed in the right order to the right people with the right safeguards. The technology of the old fleet was not simple, and it was not safe, and sharing it required judgment, but they shared it. Shipyards across the conclave, some of them the largest manufacturing facilities in the galaxy, built by civilizations with millions of years of engineering experience, retooled. The things they began producing looked different from anything they had built before. They were designed with human input, shaped by 800,000 years of knowledge about what actually worked against what was coming. They were larger than conventional warships. They were built from materials that had not been in common use for millennia. They were built to last and to fight and to survive the kind of engagement that no other species had ever needed to survive. The 3 colony worlds, Hera's Landing, New Carthage, the Pale Reach remained human. No one mentioned the Vethka claim. Again, Yara became the first non-human member of what the Directorate began calling the Extended Council, expanded version of the Inner Circle that had maintained humanity's secrets for 800,000 years, now opened carefully and deliberately to individuals from other civilizations who had the clearance and the judgment to handle what was in it. She was good at her job. She had always been good at finding things that did not want to be found. And there was, it turned out, a great deal still to find. 800,000 years of records contain more than any single mind could absorb in a lifetime, and the task of understanding it, of translating it and contextualizing it for a galaxy that was only now learning it existed, was enormous. She worked on it for years. She brought in colleagues she trusted. She trained people from a dozen different civilizations to navigate the archive's depths. She wrote the first comprehensive summary of the Progenitor War accessible to non-human readers, a document that, when it was published through the Conclave's shared library system, was read by more beings than any document in galactic history. She never stopped thinking about the line she had read in David Rail's post-war memoir, short account he had written privately and eventually allowed to be published, about what he had felt standing on the bridge of the absolute meridian watching the old fleet rise. He had written, "I felt something I had no name for in that moment, only later reading what Director Solis had told the Conclave did I understand what it was. It was the feeling of something very large that you did not know was there, shifting into view, not a threat. Foundation, as though the ground beneath everything I had ever known had just revealed that it was and always had been solid." She understood that feeling. She had felt it herself, sitting in that small room after 6 days in the archive, looking at what had been done and what it had cost and why. It was the feeling of a frame expanding, of the picture you were looking at suddenly being so much larger than you had thought, and finding, against all expectation, that the larger picture was not terrifying. It was almost a comfort. When the fleet moved to the galactic rim, it moved slowly, not because the ships were slow. The old ships could move at speeds that still made Conclave scientists quietly lose their composure. When they ran the numbers, they moved slowly because the new ships, the ones built by the Alliance, the Vethka and the Salin and the Garaf and the 63 other civilizations that had committed to the project, were still learning their capabilities, still calibrating, still finding the edges of what they could do. The fleet waited for them, kept pace with them. It was Marin Solis' thought, watching the formation from the bridge of the ship she had been given, a human ship, one of the originals, its interior so old that the air inside it smelled of something she had no word for, something ancient and familiar and deeply still. It was the right pace, not the pace of impatience, not the pace of confidence, but the pace of a thing that understood what it was doing and why. She stood at the forward viewport and looked at the formation. The old ships were on the outer ring, dark, vast, patient. They had done this before. They knew how to do this. The new ships were on the inner ring, bright in comparison to the old ones, built by civilizations that had not needed to hide what they were making, that had built with pride and openness, and the specific determination of beings who had learned something about themselves in a very short time and intended to prove it. Between the two rings in the space that separated old from new, there were small vessels moving back and forth, communications craft, supply shuttles, engineers moving between ships to consult and check and refine the visible business of an alliance actually functioning, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but functioning. Marion watched it for a long time. She thought about Hadri in the circular room, saying they had hoped they would never need to wake them again. She thought about the council standing when Elder Thesivane stood. She thought about Davith Rail's pale eyes in the question he had asked her, "Do you trust us to mean it?" And the way she had answered. She thought about the 37 civilizations that had not made it to this moment, that would never know what was being built here or why, that had been erased so completely that even their names were gone, only the gaps where they should have been remained. Negative spaces in the galactic record. Quiet and permanent, she thought. We remember you. We have always remembered you. That is why we are here. The fleet reached the galactic rim in the deep sensors far out past the edge of the galaxy's last light. The readings from the intergalactic dark had grown stronger over the months of preparation. Whatever was moving out, there was still a long way off. Centuries away, the analyst said. Time enough to finish what had been started. Time enough to prepare. But it was there, moving, coming inward the way it had come inward 800,000 years ago, with the same patient, consuming purpose it had carried. Then the fleet settled into its position at the rim and held 847 old ships, dark and still and ancient beyond anything else in the galaxy, surrounded by the new ships of 66 civilizations that had chosen to stand alongside them. Marion Solis looked out at the dark. "We are here," she said quietly to nothing and everything. The fleet waited. The dark, for now, did not answer, but it was coming, and when it arrived, it would find what it had found 800,000 years ago. A line that held, a species that remembered, a galaxy that had learned in the short time it had been given that the best answer to the dark was not to fear it alone. It was to face it. Together, humanity had held the line. Once, they would hold it again, and this time, they would not hold it alone.